I know that many of us have been watching the news coming out of Asia this past month, the Gen Z revolutions, or even the South Asian Spring, as it's been called by some people, with revolutionary movements over the last year, actually, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and it's been unfolding. It's driven by youth, it's driven by women, poor masses across the region, and it's an outpouring of rage against corruption and a system that degrades people, degrades their sense of personal dignity, and inflames a sense of social anger. And there are really startling similarities with the Arab Spring in 2011 on that account that I think is going to make studying 2011 very instructive. In 2011 and 2012, there was a generational wave of radicalization. I think that's the best way to describe this. Not just confined to the Arab world. This had a global impact. And immediately, following the revolutions, you have an explosion of the anti-austerity movement that for a few years since 2008 had been simmering. In Greece, you have the occupation of Syntagma Square and the anti-austerity movement there that would give rise to the new reformist party Syriza. You would have the rise of the Indignados movement, or 15M in Spain. Occupy, of course, in the US, protesters in Cairo famously sent a pizza to Occupy Wall Street protesters in New York's Zuccotti Park during the time. And what this proved is that revolutions don't respect borders. Solidarity comes naturally to people, and even on the other side of the planet. And the outpouring of international solidarity in the inspiration that was born from the Arab revolutions was unprecedented. I don't think we can understate the influence this had on the psychology of the masses around the world, and therefore on everything that has come since then. The psychological question is extremely important. How working people see themselves, how they're able to generalize the struggles that they face on a day-to-day basis, of recognizing this isn't just my struggle, this is our struggle. And the Arab Revolution certainly did that. One other example of its impact, it seems like it's almost forgotten today, but for me it was one of the moments, one of the moments where your political consciousness takes a step forward, was the occupation of the Wisconsin state capitol in 2011. By February 20th that year, protesters had undertaken physical occupation of the Capitol building in Madison. They'd established a fully functioning community within the public spaces of the Wisconsin state capitol. We don't learn this anymore. This is a very important part of recent history. When they rallied and protested, they made signs that said, "Fight like an Egyptian." And that was a slogan that was used around the world at the time. In trying to sum up the movements seen around the world, a Spanish paper, who was actually talking about the 15M movement, but making an observation that this was worldwide, says, "They are rallying against high unemployment, welfare cuts, politicians, the political system, banks, and public corruption." Capitalism in so many words. So the job of a revolutionary historian is to explain how an event couldn't have happened in any other way but how it did. That a revolution isn't explained or justified after the fact. It can be only understood as part of the chain of cause and effect that makes revolution an inevitable thing in society. And for Marxists, that revolutions are part of the laws of development of society and of history. So we're not surprised by them. And in this case, we can be very proud of the fact that in December 2010, of an issue of our paper, of our section at that time, it was called Socialist Appeal. This is what it looked like. Yeah, real interesting piece of history here. I remember this is one of the first pieces of communist literature I'd ever looked at in my life. This copy of the paper right here, December 2010. And you can see right here, Egypt, the gathering storm. In December of 2020, a month before Egypt was inflamed in revolution. By our next issue, it had exploded. And compare this to what the bourgeois were saying at the time. The Economist on the 6th of January 2011 wrote, "Tunisia's troubles are unlikely to seat the 74-year-old president or even to jolt his autocracy." Not even a jolt. After the revolution had already started to spread, even at that point, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, on the 25th of January said, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable and is looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs of the Egyptian people." It's great. No, they're completely blind. Some commentators even said that Egypt's lower level of education precluded them entirely from having a revolution. They're too stupid, in essence. The prejudices of the bourgeois actually render them too stupid to understand when a revolutionary process is already taking place and how it's inevitable that they unfold. Back in 2011, of course, it has to be said, revolutions didn't happen every day. You know, the capitalist crisis, it wasn't really a given. The resistance of the masses and of the working class, it wasn't really apparent everywhere the way that I think we can say it is today. It took time for consciousness to catch up between, you know, the crisis and the attacks of 2008 against the working class and this, you know, awakening explosion of the anti-austerity movement in late 2010 and early 2011. The US, of course, spent its way out of the crisis at that time, or at least tried to, with stimulus, right? Pumping money into the banks and into the economy. And that, of course, laid the basis for the inflationary and debt crises that we're facing now. And the European and Arab bourgeois tried to do the same. But the fact is they didn't have the same latitude that the US had, that the US, of course, enjoyed because of its advantageous position in the world economy, even at that time. So instead, much more quickly, they turned to vicious austerity and the dismantling of services in a way that the US is now catching up to. So after 2011, consciousness really caught up with a bang. At this point, I want to say, I feel like we weren't really swimming against the stream anymore. 2011, I think, is when we truly entered a phase of world revolution as a response to the capitalist crisis. And I think that phase began then. It existed right up to the present day when we talk about this as an era of revolution. The masses at that time in the Arab world, they toppled dictatorships that seemed impossible to unseat. You have to understand this. They seemed untouchable. Ben Ali in Tunisia ruled for 23 years. He was overthrown in 3 weeks. Mubarak in Egypt ruled 29 years, overthrown in 18 days. Saleh in Yemen ruled for 22 years, was overthrown within a year. Gaddafi in Libya, 42 years, was overthrown within the year. And the echo of these events has resonated ever since. Even after the ruling class sort of gained control of the situation in 2013 and 2014. And we'll certainly talk about, you know, the counter-revolution. But even in countries where the regimes weren't overthrown outright, this ushered in a new era of combativeness by the masses. Their demand for dignity in their livelihoods, that's really what characterizes this revolution. It was a demand for basic recognition of their rights as human beings. A new phase of the class struggle opened up after this. After decades of submission in so many of these countries, the last became first, and they lifted their heads and started to fight. The catalyst, of course, was the 2008 economic crisis, and the capitalist world has never recovered since. Many countries were involved, and like as I've described, like this is a global phenomenon, but we're gonna really focus for the benefit of the discussion on Egypt and Tunisia, where the revolution went the furthest. And we should remember too, throughout this, the masses did all of this, overthrew regime after regime, sometimes multiple within one country. They did this without any prearranged organization or program. There was nobody telling them what to do. Their call was for basic democratic rights, which are in theory realizable under capitalism. But in actual fact, because of how decrepit and dysfunctional capitalism is today, they found in practice, and we can, you know, put forward in practice, this can only be solved through a socialist revolution. So the story begins, story time. Story begins in Tunisia, in a town called Sidi Bouzid. And this region was pretty rural, semi-rural. It was dominated by pretty, you know, semi-pastoral farming through the 80s and 90s. You know, very, you know, farmer, small, you know, craftsmen and home crafts oriented. In less than 30 years, though, through investment, primarily from outside of the region, it became one of the premier agricultural hubs in Tunisia. And Tunisia was, of course, ruled by France up into the 50s when it gained at least formal independence through a bourgeois nationalist government. And the result of this development is, it's a common one throughout the post-colonial world. The wealth extracted from the land went largely to landowners and urban capitalists, while the small farmers and townspeople were uprooted and largely immiserated. They were effectively sold out by the state and landowners and opened up to foreign investment. There wasn't a development of industry or of jobs that matched the rate at which people were being uprooted, so they were pauperized in effect, turned into urban poor. And because it was helmed by private landowners, of course, working through a corrupt bourgeois state, that's why Tunisia had this uneven development, this uneven nature, and left a lot of these urban people, masses, in grinding poverty. And of course, the bureaucracy and the police were instruments of plunder. They used bribes and intimidation as a means to get by themselves. They made sure they ate first, in other words. But then, at one point, after repeated attacks after the crisis of 2008, which plunged living conditions into an even worse state in Tunisia and Egypt for that matter, quantity turned into quality. And I mean, there's an ancient Arab proverb that we're probably all familiar with, is the straw that broke the camel's back, right? I think I've always liked how dialectical that is. And today, we'll talk about that. The straw had a name. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi. And like millions of young people around the world, and the Arab world in particular, he'd been robbed of an opportunity by the capitalist crisis. He was 26. He became a street vendor due to his family falling on hard times. Their property had been taken by the bank after they used it as collateral to try to finance improvements to the land to make it productive, but then family members fell sick. We all know the story, right? It's remarkably relatable to families that struggle and find themselves on hard times. And, like many other youth, especially those struggling to make a living, he tried to do so. He hustled, he did whatever he could. He took to selling fruit out of a cart. He was harassed endlessly by local officials who insisted he needed a permit to sell fruit from his little cart. What they really wanted were bribes. Legally, there's actually wasn't any requirement for this permit. They were just extorting him. And when he couldn't pay, they would take his goods. And they did this over and over and over again. And this is just the type of pressure that the police and officials exerted. On December 16th, 2010, he took out a loan of about $200 to get some goods to try to sell and make some money. And that following morning, as he was pulling his cart along to the market, he was stopped by police and what they call a municipal inspector, professional bribe gatherer or extorter. And they did the usual shakedown to him. They demanded to see a permit. But for whatever reason, this time Bouazizi, he didn't take it silently. At some point, he protested. He stood up for himself. He had no choice to a certain extent, right? He's out of money. He's in debt for the goods he is trying to sell, and he knows they're going to take them from him, and he's going to be further in the hole. So for standing up for himself, he was beaten, he was spit on, all of his goods were taken away. And, his fruit cart, it wasn't just his livelihood, it was survival for his family. He was a primary breadwinner for his family. He supported his mother, his uncle, several younger siblings. He was trying to pay for one of his sisters to attend university. And as soon as they left him, he began making appeals, first to the police, who just, said, well, if you want your stuff back, they got to pay a bribe, which of course he couldn't do. Went to the municipal office, they mocked him, they sent him away. His final appeal was to the governor. The governor refused to see or even listen to him, even after Bouazizi was quoted as saying, if you don't see me, I'll burn myself. And within the hour, he was standing in the middle of traffic shouting, how do you expect me to make a living? And then he made good on his threat. He poured gasoline all over his body and set himself on fire. And, he would spend the final few weeks of his life after that in a coma before he died of infection. And the fact is, this act of despair, it wasn't an isolated tragedy. It certainly wasn't the first time that a promising young person had committed suicide in the Middle East out of a lack of opportunities, or for that matter, around the world, because of a lack of opportunity, a lack of the ability to see any kind of a future, because the system has robbed you of it. But it became publicized. And then his death became like a lightning bolt that lights a wildfire, something we're familiar with in California. It's the lightning bolt is just the accident. What sets the fire is actually the accumulation of that inflammable material all around the forest that's just waiting for something to set it off. And it was the concentrated expression of what millions were feeling already: poverty, humiliation, anger at the arrogance of corrupt officials, the feeling of you can't escape the misery, you can't escape the desperation. And of course, the iron grip of this regime that had been in power for decades, that had overseen the selling out of the entire country. And so it encapsulated the anger of a generation. And all at once, the dams burst. Incidentally, the protests were modest at first, but very militant, very angry. And what I think spurred it on was how swift the repression was. The police opened fire. They killed a few dozen in the final days of December when the protests happened. But instead of scaring people back into silence, each funeral became a new protest, became a new demonstration, became a new layer of martyrs to fight for and to fight with. And in decades, all of a sudden, decades of this accumulated anger just burst forward. Thousands more joined in the streets every day. The working class began to move decisively. By early January 2011, strikes were breaking out all across the country. The teachers, lawyers, all kinds of trade organizations, and crucially, a very powerful trade union, the UGTT, entered the struggle. UGTT, it was not a radical union whatsoever, but was forced to the left over those years since 2008 as workers demanded a fight back from their leaders against austerity and all of the misery created by the crisis. So once the UGTT locals in the interior of the country began calling general strikes, the momentum became unstoppable. You have this on top of popular protests where tens of thousands of people are clashing openly with police on the streets. On January 14th, after 23 years in power, Ben Ali fled the country. And of course, it was jubilation on the streets. They'd overthrown this hated dictator in less than a month. He fled, of course, to Saudi Arabia, the US government's favorite degenerate monarchy. And yeah, this was a huge success. But it has to be said, it didn't go all the way. There wasn't a fundamental transformation of society from this. The masses didn't take power into their hands, even though it was right there in the street to be taken. What happened was the ruling class regrouped remnants of the old state. The Prime Minister, Mohamed Ghannouchi, stayed in office. Ben Ali was gone, but it was the same state apparatus that stayed in his place. And unfortunately, the gap between the immense energy and courage of the masses in the street and the absence of a revolutionary leadership to take it further, that would define not just Tunisia, but really the whole Arab Spring, and we'll see that in varying contexts. But still, the Tunisian revolution lit this match, and the fire didn't go away for a long time. It reverberated across the Arab world: Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Yemen, Jordan. Everywhere, thousands of people poured into the streets saying, look, if Tunisia can do it, so can we. And above all, the spark leaped across to Egypt. And on January 25th, 2011, just 11 days after Ben Ali fled Tunisia, it was Egypt which erupted. And the target was, of course, Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled for nearly 30 years. The same sort of mix of repression and corruption, subservience to imperialism. He was a big stooge for that. At the time, 40% of Egyptians lived on less than $2 a day. And of course, this is while Mubarak and the bourgeois around him live in literal palaces, ostentatious displays of wealth. Again, South Asian Spring, the similarities are remarkable. And a central driver of the oligarchy was the plan to have Mubarak's son Gamal succeed his father as president and establish basically a dynasty. And the plan, was, this was fully backed by the business elite, by the bourgeois, some of which I'm sure would describe themselves as liberal. They're socially, they're progressive. They're not like, the masses with their superstitions. They understand the setup of the government. They're educated people, but they're totally fine with the dictatorship as long as it continues to shell out money to them or secure the means to do that. So it would be wrong to say that the movements flowed solely from Tunisia, you know, as far as the impetus for revolution. People were inspired by Tunisia, but the working class in Egypt already begun to awaken over the last 3 years. And yeah, I mean, there were also, you know, a couple decades of struggle, but really since 2008, there's a pitched struggle, particularly against privatizations and the selling out of the country. A major turning point came on April 6, 2008, where there's a mass strike in the industrial city of Mahala, home to more than 25,000 workers. It was one of the largest textile factories in Africa. And the strike took on an insurrectionary character. And out of this came wildcat sit-ins. You know, the workers are taking action without explicit direction or the permission of their leaders. They're just doing it. You know, all of this happened outside of, yeah, the regime-controlled Egyptian Trade Union Federation, totally reactionary and repressive union. In fact, it worked hand in glove with the state to try to crush the strikes, very similar to what you see in like the Russian Revolution with the Tsarist police unions. So the workers overcame these obstacles to take action into their own hands. Between 2007 and 2010, there were 2,100 strikes and protests, all of them taking place on an independent basis, outside of the state unions. In fact, there were mass resignations from those unions as the workers tried to find their own way forward, recognizing that we don't want more class collaboration, we don't want more empty promises, we want to fight on our own terms. And all of that was a sign of what was to come. Just another fact about the Mahala strike, it was initiated largely by women. Around 3,000 garment workers, women walked out first, and they effectively shamed the men into action. And again, you see this in revolution after revolution, or you know, even just the working class movement. The central position as some of the bravest fighters and the most, you know, hard-nailed, you know, fighters in a revolution, it stands out across the Arab world, and this is enormously significant. It showed that, you know, fighting back on using working class methods is the way forward for women. And during the Mahala strike, you had them saying, you know, where are the men? Here are the women, you know, urging them to strike with them. Over the next couple of years, the mood of anger continued to build. It becomes more popular. Ordinary Egyptians, I watched a lot of documentaries in preparation for the leadoff. In interviews across ordinary Egyptians in Cairo, in the lead up to the revolution, you hear them saying things like, you can't find a single hospital that will take you if you get sick. You can't find a single school for your kids. All of these schools are private. They're for rich people only. Mubarak has done nothing for us. There's no work. All the shops have closed. Mubarak has stolen millions. Meanwhile, we have nothing to eat. We've gotten tired. We have had enough. This is the language of a revolutionary movement in the making. It's not people saying, oh boy, wouldn't a revolution be swell? It's, I can't take it anymore. And this is becoming the only option available to us. I want to, you know, before we get to the revolution itself, I want to pull back a little bit and look at how did Egypt get to this point. And I think to talk about just a little bit of the history of the, you know, Egypt and its political traditions, you have to talk about Nasser. And General Gamal Abdel Nasser is still remembered in Egypt as an anti-imperialist. He rose to the head of a popular movement during the post-war wave of colonial revolutions in the 40s and 50s. And in essence, he attempted to modernize and industrialize Egypt. But every reform that he tried to put forward, it faced heavy resistance from imperialism and sabotage. But his popularity really endures because he acted as a hero against foreign domination, you know, for self-determination. He talked about socialism a bit, but it was, you know, he was never a Marxist. You know, he very explicitly rejected an emphasis on classes, and in place of that all-important feature of Marxism and you know, socialist ideas and politics, he put forward national unity, which taken to its conclusion does mean class collaboration on a national basis. Nasser's regime at the time, it was Bonapartist. It balanced between the classes. He acted sort of semi-independently of the bourgeoisie and imperialism. He nationalized the banks, insurance, and cotton industries, and a few more other important sectors. But because he didn't have a party, you know, he didn't have a party of Bolsheviks, he himself wasn't a Marxist, they could never really allow for the full flowering of a workers' democracy. All of this was top down. But he did rely on mass support to push reforms, while at the same time not undermining fundamentally military control of the country. He did nationalize the Suez Canal, which provoked a big reaction from Britain and France and Israel, leading to the Suez Crisis of 1956. You know, a vast portion of the world's oil supply travels through the Suez Canal, so this was, yeah, a very big crisis. But the imperialist attempt to invade failed under international pressure, and ultimately the result of this was this sort of pan-Arab nationalism that Nasser put forward swelled. It surged in support. But yeah, Nasser's reforms were limited. Capitalism remained. There wasn't a complete system of planning. And what planning was there ensured that a bureaucracy started to grow and corruption starts to spread. And the regime ultimately stopped halfway. Workers' gains weren't secured within a workers' democracy, which is the only way to secure them. And so after Nasser's death in 1970, you have the reversal of some of these reforms and rolling back some of the social gains. Very quickly thereafter, you have Mubarak taking power, who continued privatizations, and all of this obviously further deepened inequality and poverty. And to such an extent, in 1997, Mubarak's government enacted a law, the investment incentives law. It permitted 100% foreign ownership of investment projects in Egypt. So it's just, here you go, gift to the foreign bourgeois. Take all our wealth, plunder the country. Yeah, in 2010, Egypt's foreign direct investment reached $6.8 billion. And yeah, these were bribes for Egypt's ruling class and ruling clique to sell out their country. Now, there was the Egyptian communist left at the time, which was composed of Stalinists, but also others. And they all capitulated to Nasserism pretty much entirely, in particular that nationalist basis. Also, Nasser had this sort of stagist theory of revolutions, basically, that it would unfold in successive stages. First, you have the political stage, and then the social stage, which presumably the social stage is where you actually eradicate class inequality, but that's put off until some indefinite future time. And obviously, this dooms his program to establish not a worker state or a socialist state, but a nationalist bourgeois state. And not one that can move towards socialism. So it's important to cover this because a party of Marxists, to be successful in a place like Egypt, has to do considerable work to make sure you're fully immunized against nationalism. The question of overcoming imperialism, it's an internationalist class question. The working class can only rely on its own forces and methods to do that, not those preaching national unity, which again is just cover for class collaboration. So yeah, the legacy of Nasserism is a warning against making half a revolution. It's against reformism. And in the same way that Hugo Chavez is, honestly, there's a lot of similarities there too. They were both revolutionary Democrats, came up against imperialism in their attempts at reform, flirted with nationalizations, but failed to go all the way. And now the masses are living with the repercussions of this. So all of that is to say that on January 25th, when the revolution began, it had no official leadership among the existing parties or the organizations in the country. They'd all been sidelined or discredited, in effect. The regime had established a holiday, National Police Day, to celebrate the armed bodies of the state. In response to this, the youth and activists online, they called for instead a day of rage to protest police brutality and corruption. Finally, it came on January 25th, and the first protests in Cairo, Alexandria, Suez, Mahala, all were met with brutal repression. Notice a pattern. Tear gas, rubber bullets, live ammunition was used freely. But just as in Tunisia, repression spurred the movement on. In Suez, the police lost control within days. By January 28th, it turned into a week of rage. That was the Friday of rage. The masses confronted the regime head on. They started torching police stations, overrunning government buildings. They took over the state news network, and the Interior Ministry was surrounded and occupied. Thousands of strikes also happened simultaneously across Cairo and the whole of Egypt. Again, no program, no no organization to speak of, just the masses acting in their own interests, instinctively. Mubarak responded by shutting down the internet. He unleashed his security forces as well as any forces he can muster, including sort of that passively rotting social mass of people. The people who hang out around the pyramids in Cairo to give tourist tours, he rallied those guys and had them ride camels into the crowds in Cairo. It was pretty insane scenes of how desperate a counter-revolution gets. It's summoning up, the grinding thin layer of the petty bourgeois and the lumpen proletariat to try to get out there and smash the workers, but it wasn't nearly enough. And the decisive shift, of course, came when the army was deployed. And the generals sort of posed as neutral arbiters. They could sort of read the writing on the wall. This isn't going away. And tried to facilitate some change to stability and arbiters between the regime and the masses. But the rank and file soldiers, these were all conscripts drawn from the same poor backgrounds as the protesters. Instead of shooting into the crowds, they fraternized with them. There's a funny quote from Napoleon: "Bayonets are wonderful things, but they're rather poor to sit on. One can do anything with bayonets except sit on them, and once the bayonets begin thinking, it's all over." Right? So you can't trust a soldier who starts to think. You can't trust a soldier that starts to correspond with people from a similar social position and comes to conclusions about what their shared interests are. The epicenter, of course, became Tahrir Square in Cairo. Now, Egypt is the largest Arab country. It's got a working class numbering in the millions. It's strategically placed in industry and infrastructure. And once the weight of that working class was felt, Mubarak's position became totally untenable. Once again, women played a vitally important role in the movement. Before the revolution, of course, many women in Egypt weren't even allowed to leave their house if it wasn't for work, if they didn't have a reason. Explicitly, they faced constant harassment and repression. But then during the revolution, all of a sudden, half the people in Tahrir Square are women. And they were absolutely central to its success. Men learned this in practice. Fighting side by side with women, they came to see how essential their role was, not just as equal, but they are indispensable to the revolution's victory. In Tahrir Square, anyone who tried to harass a woman was immediately confronted. They would spray paint on their chest, "I am a harasser," on anyone harassing women, and would drive them out of the square. That's revolutionary morality at work and overcoming any and all divisions, not because like Marxists preach class consciousness raising stuff, but because they come to these conclusions practically by taking action. Every sector in the country was hit by strikes, especially the strategic ones. And the real reason Mubarak fell wasn't just the mass demonstrations in Tahrir Square. It was, again, the entry of the working class into the struggle. And I mean, the critical point came when the strike movement reached the Suez Canal. 6,000 canal workers walked out. They went around urging everybody to shut everything down. Had they succeeded completely, it would have halted 80% of the world's oil transport and shaken the world economy, which in 2011 was not in a good way. The imperialist powers then, who spent decades bleeding Egypt dry, saw everything slipping out of their hands, and they decided we got to get this guy out. And that's when the army command finally turned on Mubarak and ousted him. Again, not out of revolutionary sympathy. They had no choice. They had to divert this before it escalated further. So Mubarak was forced to resign. There was an explosion of joy across the country. But again, removing the dictator did not remove the system. Power passed to the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, who were the same generals who had managed the state under Mubarak. In some ways, even more responsible for the management of the state than Mubarak was. They promised elections and reform, and of course, all the while worked to contain the movement. And we see the central problem. The masses showed incredible courage, sacrifice, determination. They occupied squares, they struck in their workplaces, but again, the question of state power wasn't resolved, and the army high command held the levers of power. Now, the movement didn't end in February. There, of course, there was sort of a waiting with bated breath to see what would come next. And in the months that followed, there would be new waves of strikes and protests breaking out, demanding higher wages, union rights, accountability, justice, revolutionary justice against those who killed protesters. And Tahrir Square remained a symbol. It was repeatedly reoccupied when promises were broken by this interim government. But the longer the power remained in the hands of the general, that was more time that the counter-revolutionary forces had to regroup, and they did, and that laid the basis for what came next. Now, these events sent shockwaves across the entire Arab world, in Algeria, Morocco, Yemen, Libya, Syria. I don't have time to cover these. But needless to say, each country had its own peculiarities. The common thread is clear, and it shows, the Arab Revolution, you hear even still today, it was it was a social media revolution. It was a product of people just being online and talking enough, and that's what did it. As Western commentators claimed, it wasn't just a youth movement. All of this is said to minimize the role of the masses, and especially of the working class. And it wasn't at all that. It was the culmination of, again, decades of accumulated contradictions throughout North Africa and the Middle East. Mass unemployment, especially among the youth, was a powerful factor. Skyrocketing food and fuel prices, corruption, police brutality. And so all of this was, was suffocating to the masses, and they finally reacted against it. Now, for us, Bolshevism, Bolsheviks, we aim to weld class consciousness and the unity of the oppressed and exploited into a party that represents their interests. It's the political expression of the revolutionary aims of the working class. We're conscious revolutionary actors. And in the same way, many of the bourgeois are conscious counter-revolutionary actors, and they drop their plans early. Their role is to derail the movement of the masses. They explain revolutions as arriving from eccentricities and exceptions rather than understanding them as part of how society evolves, as we do. And so some of the young intelligentsia, especially in Egypt, were consciously selected by the media. They were pushed forward, and especially into Western media, as the faces of the Arab Revolution. And yeah, I mean, they were put forward consciously, kind of a neoliberal Bolshevism, if you'll pardon the term. It was sort of the, many of them had sort of drank the Kool-Aid of liberalism. They were educated, often in other parts of the world, and then came back with this, ideas of how we're going to turn Egypt into a democracy. And they were a significant part of the subjective factor of this revolution. And this is why, if you go back and watch the interviews with these people, you generally get a very confused mishmash. They are literally torn between their education as bourgeois liberals and their sympathy to the revolution. And so their conception is one of, we got to set up a liberal democracy. Therefore, the excesses of the revolution, we've got to tamper those down. We've got to get back to stability and kind of create this mythical, peaceful transition to democratic capitalism. And their minds are so ingrained with the logic of class collaboration, they end up betraying the revolution in words, and even if they don't realize it. And so, yeah, that had an effect, I think, on how the world also saw, Tunisia and Egypt in the Arab Spring. Even the idea Arab Spring, it's not really a revolution, or it's something different. And that said, we understand a revolution isn't a revolution because of its leadership. That's not how you define it. It's a revolution because it's an insurrection by the masses who are motivated by the raw desire to change the social order. They want to overthrow the status quo. Every revolution worth the name, that is what it is. And the masses themselves, like in terms of what demands emerge from the movement, they might frame this, it's a struggle for democracy in the abstract. But for the masses, this means control over their lives. It doesn't mean the right to vote for who's going to misrepresent them every few years. Democratic demands flow naturally, I think, from the tasks of the socialist revolution, so we can speak to them. Consistently striving for democracy will always pose the question, what is the material basis of that democracy? Democracy for who? What's the class character of the state that's going to have this democracy? And so the struggle itself shows how the democracy of the mass is fighting for. It's not the same as what the bourgeois want, as what the bourgeois have. It's based on their property and privileges. We want control over our lives. We want control over our livelihoods. And as a whole, the masses have to also experience bourgeois democracy in order to understand its limitations. And we can see that around the world today, right? As people are, those limits are being recognized by the masses. And not just with the South Asian Spring. In the core of world capitalism, it's very evident that the interests of the bourgeois, where they have to implement austerity, where they're struggling to retain political control, they're on a collision course with democracy. They're whittling away at it by little bits and pieces, whatever scraps of democratic representation is normally given in normal times. So when mass movements do spontaneously raise demands that address immediate needs that can't be fulfilled within capitalism, that presents opportunities. We, as revolutionaries, see that as opportunities to clarify the class nature of the revolution. And I've seen this, those who call themselves Marxists, who complain that, a revolution isn't really a revolution because the class character, hasn't been clarified. That's what communists are for. Like, that's why we exist. That's who we are. To those who say the Arab Spring was not a revolution, we can give Lenin the last word. This is what he said: "To imagine that a social revolution is conceivable without revolts of small nations in the colonies and in Europe, without the revolutionary outbursts of the petty bourgeoisie, with all its prejudices, without a movement of non-class conscious proletarian and semi-proletarian masses against the oppression of the landlords, the church, the monarchy, the foreign yoke, to imagine that is tantamount to repudiating social revolution. Whoever expects a pure revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what a revolution is." It is confused. It is the masses driven by a raw desire. They're groping their way forward for social change, and they learn through experience. And initially, these movements, they don't recognize the anti-capitalist nature of their own demands. That is what our program is for. That's why the communists need to be there to clarify it. The Arab Revolution showed the enormous potential of the masses. They elementally shook these regimes to their core, overthrew them entirely. That doesn't require a party. That doesn't require a finished program. But at the same time, the revolutions demonstrated without Bolshevik leadership and political clarity, reaction can gain the upper hand, and that's what happened. In Egypt, the generals took over to facilitate the transition, promised democracy, of course. Their real aim was to preserve the regime, and this was still the naive stage of the revolution. There was trust, there were illusions in liberals and reformists. The Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they intervened with money, weapons, political maneuvering. The support of world capitalism was behind, retaining stability, even if it meant drowning the revolutions and smothering them in blood. In Tunisia, Mohamed Ghannouchi tried to keep control, but mass demonstrations forced his resignation. That's now two governments overthrown. And a transitional government was formed, leading to elections in October of that year. The Islamic Party, Ennahda, won the largest share. And of course, it presented itself as a force for change. But once in power, they pursued the same capitalist policies, clashed with workers and youth, reassuring foreign investors. They were a bourgeois regime. And so, yeah, this was all channeled into sort of parliamentary maneuvering, and the masses were increasingly sidelined. Likewise, in Egypt, in the final week before Mubarak fell, power was literally in the streets, waiting for someone to take it, but no leadership stepped forward. And in the absence of a revolutionary force, power was taken by the SCAF, an institution totally tied to US imperialism, and the army stepped in to, not to defend the revolution, but to prevent the overthrow of Egyptian capitalism. But very quickly, illusions in the army crumbled. The SCAF banned strikes. It arrested thousands of protesters. 12,000 people were thrown into prison at the time. And elections, such as they could be, were then held in November. You had Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. They ran against the regime's sort of hand-picked candidate. And this polarized the vote. It allowed Morsi to win 24%. With 24%, and only about 46% of eligible voters participated in the election. Not a very reassuring sign of this becoming a democracy. Most Egyptians didn't vote at all, right? And those that did, they backed Morsi because he seemed like the lesser evil. There was also what you could call a left wing. There was a Nasserist candidate who won around 20%. And that did show, there was a genuine desire for some left-wing alternative. Even if it was just a faint echo of the past, there was a desire for it. But the Muslim Brotherhood was the best organized, it was the best financed political force in the country, and so power naturally shifted in their direction. And we should be clear, certainly religion played a role at this point throughout all of this. During the revolution, the consciousness of the working class, it leaps ahead. It very typically surpasses the official leaders of the working class. The dissolution of religious antagonisms during the revolution, that was a really miraculous example of what, that we see repeatedly in revolutionary history. But religion, up to this point, it never became a dividing issue, especially during the high points of the revolution. In Tahrir Square, you had Sunnis and Shias. They came together. They defended, the Coptic Christians from the police and the reactionary Islamic gangs that were, the regime was backing up. And Christians did the same for Muslims. Above all, they saw themselves as revolutionaries. They were in mutual struggle against their oppressors. But the entry of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's this organization of religious bourgeois reaction. It's got a petty bourgeois activist base. They work to cut across that unity. And this organization, there were genuine illusions in them. They kind of posed themselves as the defenders of the poor. They did charity work for a very long time. They ran food drives. They built a network of support among the impoverished. And so people saw that. They thought, okay, that represents maybe something more humane, something better. But the Brotherhood's leadership was pretty thoroughly degenerate and petty bourgeois. They concealed the class interest behind that charitable image. And the fact was, materially, they'd long been funded by sections of the Egyptian bourgeois, as well as sort of quietly being backed by Western imperialism. So under Mubarak, they'd been sort of tolerated as controlled opposition. When they finally did take power, again, lots of illusions in them, but once in office, they aligned themselves with the army, and they used police to suppress any demonstrations against the government. And so, yeah, it didn't take long for people to see the truth. They're no different than the regime we just overthrown. And in fact, Morsi's regime proved even more repressive than Mubarak. Even in those final days, they got rid of even what few reforms from the Nasser period still exist in terms of privatization. And that betrayal sparked the next sort of, I want to say the next stage in the revolution. In reality, was sort of the last gasp. It was the largest mass movement in Egypt's history. 32 million people, roughly a third of the entire population, poured into the streets. On July 3rd of 2013, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi staged a coup, removing Morsi under the guise of defending the revolution. This is what the people want. And the irony in this is that al-Sisi was actually appointed to the head of the SCAF by Morsi. So again, we're just getting a palace coup, a restoration of the old order under a different name. In August 2013, sit-ins by Brotherhood supporters, because again, genuine illusions, they were crushed. Over 800 people were killed in a single day. This was the regime consolidating a new dictatorship. And there was, Stalinists and the other groupings notwithstanding, there was, again, what you would call a left in Egypt, but or an independent left from the Nasserists, but frankly, they were a disgrace. It was this group called the Revolutionary Socialists. And they were marching right alongside with the Brotherhood during the period of time in which they were in power, implementing austerity in defense of its democratic rights. They gave critical support to Morsi because he's the lesser evil in 2012. So it's classic class collaboration and blurring the lines of the revolution. They built up a certain authority before the revolution through their involvement in the strike movement that they were heavily involved in organizing. But that authority was totally thrown away after they lined up behind the Brotherhood. They were effectively trying to legitimize a counter-revolutionary force as an alternative to the generals. So it totally confused and demoralized the layer of workers that are thinking, well, what do the socialists have to say in this situation? We're in a revolution, like how are the socialists leading? And they led them into a blind alley. So by 2013, 2014, the sort of tide had shifted across the region. That first wave of the revolution, it had spent its energy. And yeah, I mean, not to go in, don't want to go into Libya and Syria and Yemen, but in effect, a lot of these areas, they collapse into civil wars, sectarian conflict, and it sort of proceeds from there up to the point we have today with a lot of just fractious conflict and countervailing forces of imperialism pitted against one another with the masses not yet taking an independent role. That said, I mean, these were revolutions. The legacy of 2011 can't be erased. The idea that these regimes can't be shattered, that they can't be kicked to the side. Millions of people had discovered power in the streets, in the factories, and that had an enormous impact. Even when counter-revolution triumphed, the memory of this still lives on. Now, yeah, without a revolutionary organization capable of taking power, that can lead the dismantling of the old regime, the system reconstitutes itself in one form or another. That is the lesson that the masses learned, and the price was paid in blood and betrayal and renewed repression. It's not a lesson they're going to forget anytime soon. In both Tunisia and Egypt, the turning point came, of course, not with demonstrations, but with strikes, another lesson. The revolution, I mean, it was international in character, leapt from one country to another because the conditions were shared across these regions: mass unemployment, corruption, inequality, repression. The struggle was never national in a narrow sense. It was regional, it was global. And this underlines we have to have an international strategy towards the approach of building revolutionary parties, especially in these types of regions with a shared identity. And obviously the revolution finally, it revealed the enormous potential of the youth, millions of young people facing unemployment and despair. These were the spark. They organized the first protests. They used every means of communication available and poured out into the streets. That was the first step. And so I think the Arab Revolution was not a failed movement. It was the first act in a revolutionary drama that is continuously playing out, has continued to play out over this last decade and a half. And I think so future revolutions in the region, they don't start from zero. They're going to build on this foundation. For one thing, one big step forward, dual power existed. You had workers' committees, neighborhood councils, strike networks. They all demonstrate the capacity of ordinary people to be able to actually run society. Tahrir Square was like a microcosm of what a self-organized society looks like. They had sanitation and cleaning crews. They had members set up for security. They improvised medical care. There were ongoing classes in education, so families could attend the protests without missing any schooling. I mean, this was, art and music were produced. This is all without any involvement from the capitalists, And more than that, obviously, too, outside of the square, you have demonstrations, occupations of workplaces where the workers, doctors, nurses, they start running hospitals. They start to, link up and form committees and networks. And so revolutions aren't single events, they're processes. To be successful in transforming society, revolutions do require organization, a program, clarity of purpose. A revolutionary party has to be able to connect immediate democratic demands, bread, freedom, dignity, to the overthrow of the capitalist state. I think that 1905, the Russian Revolution, actually parallels the Arab revolutions in 2011. The masses overthrow a dictatorship, in effect. They seize the streets, they form committees. There's a part in Trotsky's book in 1905. He describes how workers are using their industrial skills to manufacture makeshift weapons. He talks about, for self-defense from the police and the sort of fascist, semi-fascist Black Hundreds. And he describes how excited they are. They're taking up arms, they're fighting. It's that initial naive, energetic, combative phase of the revolution. And likewise, in documentaries with the Arab Spring, you see people picking up improvised weapons and excited, to go fight the cops. They're pulling rebar out of buildings. They're tearing bricks up from the streets to fight back. But in both cases, power was left in the hands of a government representing the capitalists. And it was paying lip service to reform. It was only when the Bolsheviks, 12 years later, linked the action of the masses to a socialist program and had the ability to put that forward, that's when you had the creation of a worker state. But the lack of a revolutionary party means the moment passes and reaction comes after that. And towards the end of the book, in 1905, Trotsky talks about like the same workers, and they're being forced to melt down the weapons that they've created. And you know, he talks about in that moment, you can see a transformation in the consciousness of the workers. They realize like, okay, makeshift weapons aren't going to be enough. You know, the state that doesn't represent it, it has to be torn up by any means necessary. We have to link up with the workers in uniform, the ordinary soldiers. We have to create something that can take state power. That's what it's going to take. So the Arab Spring, it was the first chapter, not the last. It was the first act, the dress rehearsal, even, as we described 1905 sometimes for the Russian Revolution. And so the failures showed what has to be done. And yeah, despite all of the meddling of the imperialists throughout the course of these revolutions, that they didn't see any of it coming, but they still tried to meddle in it and just sort of bungled it up even further. They couldn't intervene militarily directly to crush it. Just really quickly, with Libya and Syria, the US couldn't project influence in a significant way to settle things for its own benefit. The rulers in the Middle East and North Africa, they learned the US isn't a reliable ally. You can't count on them when the people come for you with pitchforks. You're on your own. And this is, you know, since limited US imperialism's room for maneuver in the region, in addition to its own declining ability to actually project that power, especially compared to China and Russia, who have grown in relative influence. And of course are cynically bargaining with the regimes in the exact same way that the US did. But the ruling class learned you can't count on US imperialism. On the flip side, the revolutionary masses also learned that US imperialism has limits. Ultimately, it wasn't the US that crushed this revolution. There's no one to blame but the liberal and reformist leadership. And that's a lesson they'll take forward. Concluding here, for the past 2 years, the politics of the Arab world had been reignited by Israel's genocidal war. I think we've all seen evidence of this. All of the Arab regimes are bourgeois nationalists of one form or another. They use Israel as a boogeyman to support their own positions. And they use, you know, the plight of the Palestinians as a cover for their own attacks against the masses in their country. They use the sympathy and identity that they have with Palestinians to say, see, that's why you need us. You need us to protect you from that. And so they, in fact, this is, you know, the disgusting thing, they give cover to and directly aid Israel to maintain their positions. Over 300 Egyptian companies have raked in massive profits with the Zionist state. Again, while Palestinians have been bombed and starved and slaughtered, Egypt is effectively a border guard for Israel. That's their role in the Middle East. The border between Egypt and Gaza has been a moneymaker for Egyptian officials. They're collecting bribes so that only rich Gazans can pass. And they've since closed they've closed the border. Presumably, they think all the rich Gazans have come across already. In the first 6 months of trade of 2024, trade between Egypt and Israel reached 246.6 million. That's a 53% increase from before the war. So Egypt's entire capitalist class is complicit in this treachery. And the Egyptians are aware of it, and they're getting fed up. And the ruling class knows it. Tunisia, similarly, their capitalist class is involved in this treachery. Tunisia's president, Kais Saied, dissolved the elected parliament. He started ruling by decree 3 years ago. This is a sign of weakness. It's an inability to rule in the old way. And they're actually terrified of the masses rising up again. Just as another example, a random Tunisian man was sentenced to death in the last month for criticizing Saied. And there was a massive outcry, and once talks of mobilization started back up again, the government was like, oh, just kidding, we're gonna release him. No, he's not gonna die. I mean, this is the type of arbitrary, stupid repression you get from a regime that is in a precarious position, that senses it. And so Palestine could light the whole situation up. Just because a ceasefire has been called in Gaza doesn't mean that all of this goes away. There were widespread protests in Tunisia with union involvement after the attack on the Global Samud flotilla. And before that, you had protests and outcry after a ship that was bound for Gaza with relief goods. It was bombed by an Israeli drone while it was still in a Tunisian harbor. people are pissed, and the hypocrisy of the ruling class is infuriating. Bouazizi was honored by the Tunisian government on a postage stamp. Meanwhile, they're inflicting the same crimes, the same violations of people's rights that his final act was a protest against. This has an effect on people's consciousness. And the regimes in Egypt and Tunisia today, they're able to crack down on isolated activists and youth. That's what most of their repression is targeted towards. But they know they can't attack the workers too openly. They can't strip certain rights from them, the rights to organize, because they know that that could, put them into motion again. And so the key to Palestine's liberation, it's tied up with, it's not going to come from ceasefires brokered by imperialism. It's tied up with the task of the socialist liberation of the Arab masses. And it's going to take, I think, the solution to get the Palestinians out of their position is going to be the victory of a socialist revolution in a decisive country like Egypt for the region, or an imperialist center like the United States. A socialist Egypt, an Arab socialist federation right on Israel's border, it would not allow the genocide to continue for a single second longer. The Israeli state and the ruling class, they would be made to answer for their crimes within a week. I'm willing to bet. And so the key, in other words, the key to the liberation of the Palestinians is the liberation of all Arabs, all workers and poor across the region. It's the crushing of the dictatorships all along the area, and the victory of the working class around the world. Youth unemployment today remains catastrophic in these countries. It's estimated to be as high as 40% in Tunisia. It's around 19% in Egypt, according to official figures. That's counting the informal sector, which is just people barely getting by, like Bouazizi was. The migration crisis, growing inequality, and ongoing instability, it's made life unlivable for millions. Women have been temporarily forced back into domestic servitude. They're isolated once again from social life. And so all of this is just simmering right under the surface. I just want to make a connection. In Tunisia, one of the most active layers in the revolution, impelled to fight, were college graduates who had no jobs, no prospects. They'd been educated, but there were no jobs for them to take. Recent college grads in the US are the most unemployed layer in the country. And this is a condemnation of capitalist society. It's as explosive an ingredient here as it was in the Arab Spring in 2011. So I think the most effective way to aid the working class of the world is to overthrow our own ruling class here at home. The atrocities unfolding in the Middle East, they're rooted in capitalist exploitation and imperialist domination. The struggle to liberate Palestine, it's inseparable from our struggle to dismantle capitalism around the world, and the establishment of a socialist federation across the Middle East and North Africa, and of course, the victory of a revolution right here in the belly of the beast.